Alan Dershowitz, that was definitely something that stood out to me. He has vehemently denied that he has engaged in any inappropriate conduct with any of the women. And he's a great attorney. I respect him as an attorney. And he's a great advocate for himself. I mean, I absolutely, positively believe him when he says so vehemently that he wasn't with any of the women. But then when you hear Virginia Giuffre, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, flat out rise to his challenge, where he says, I challenge her on this documentary to say that she had sex with me, and they cut right to her, yep, I had sex with him 6 times. What do you make of that?
You know, I feel very much the same way you do. And at the very beginning, on that December 31st, 2014, when the world and I read Josh Gerstein's Politico story about Miss Roberts' claims that Professor Dershowitz sexually abused her, I was shocked. I mean, I think it shocked the world, about her claims. And I had never heard it. You know, I have to say something, and I'm sorry that I have to take you all the way back. But as you know, I have been investigating cases, human trafficking, particularly child sex trafficking cases, since the year 2006. And in 2009, I stumbled upon Epstein's case. I've known Epstein. I knew Epstein. I was acquainted with Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell since the 1990s, since the early 90s. So I have known them. I have gone to dinner. I had gone to dinner with them many times. I had seen them at many events. So when the Dershowitz claim came forward, and not knowing Professor Dershowitz, only having spoken to him back in 2010 when I broke the Epstein story wide open in the Daily Beast in that 6-part series that started in July 2010 through January 2015, I was shocked. And I immediately called Professor Dershowitz and I asked him point blank, because it was, to me, it was truly shocking. He had not spoken to me in 9 years because he was very upset with me that I had written that 6-part series, which is what started this whole story rolling. And he invited me to his home in Florida. And I sat with him and his wife for almost 2.5 hours back early this year. And I have to tell you that, and this is, of course, instinct, I wasn't there. Neither was anyone else. So instinctively, I believe Professor Dershowitz. I am a victim's advocate, so I am so conflicted because my goal, my mission in life is to protect vulnerable, at-risk children from predators, be they who they may, whether they are Harvard University professors or billionaires or the guy down the street that earns $50 a month. It doesn't matter. So I was very conflicted, but after having heard Professor Dershowitz, sat down with him at his home, heard his arguments, you know, I tend to believe Professor Dershowitz that he did not. So where does that leave Miss Roberts in this whole thing? I don't know. I certainly believe she was victimized by Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. That I do believe, absolutely. I've read through all her depositions. Some of them are conflicting dates. You know, the very first deposition filed May 1st, 2009, where she is Jane 102, Jane Doe 102 versus Jeffrey Epstein, filed while she was in Australia, civil suit when he was still in jail. He was serving time in Palm Beach. She claimed her birthday being August 8th, 1983, she claimed she was barely 15 when she met Epstein. And she met Epstein because Ghislaine Maxwell met her in a bathroom at Mar-a-Lago where she was working as a bathroom attendant. And so Ghislaine convinced her, obviously, and persuaded her father to bring Miss Roberts to Epstein's home. But day 2, Epstein asked her to quit her job at Mar-a-Lago, and apparently she did. She confirms that. And she lived with Epstein for 2 years. Epstein rented an apartment for Miss Roberts in West Palm Beach, only blocks away from her father. So her father was living nearby Miss Roberts. And I don't know about you. I have children, and I know many parents. And I know that parents have this instinct when it comes to their children. And if I thought any one of my 2 children was being molested, and someone came and asked my children to pay for their apartment right near me, I would question that. I would definitely question that.
She was what age during those 2 years?
Well, she claims in the Jane Doe 102 deposition that she met Epstein when she was barely 15. And according to that deposition, she was born August 8th, 1983. Now, if you look at the other depositions and you speak to Mr. Dershowitz, she changes her age. So she also claims that she was living with Epstein and being forced to sexually service him and his powerful friends for 2 years. That would have made her 17 years old. So that means that put her on the island, that put her in London, that put her in New Mexico, that put her in Palm Beach between the years of 1998 and the year 2000. That's it. If you look at that Netflix documentary, which is filled with misinformation and inaccuracies and gaping holes, you realize that this one man who claims to have been Epstein's tech guy, the one who set up his computer, Steve Scully.
On the island.
On the island, yes, on the USVI, on USVI. Mr. Scully claims that he saw her, he witnessed Prince Andrew on top of Miss Roberts in 2004. How is that possible? How is that possible? I mean, perhaps he made a mistake. Absolutely, people make mistakes. You know, that's a very long time ago. But that Netflix and the producers didn't fact check that?
Sorry, to be clear, because you're saying by 2004 she was where?
Gone. She was married with children, living in Queensland, Australia.
Yeah. Well, the other discrepancy with that, and just for, you know, hopefully everyone watching this has seen the documentary, but she herself in the documentary doesn't allege that she was with Prince Andrew on the island.
Correct.
She talks about the incident in London.
In
London. Here
London.
You've got that guy saying it happened, and she herself isn't even accusing him of that.
Right. I mean, you know, I disqualified the Filthy Rich Netflix documentary for several reasons. Reason number one, it wasn't really based on Mr. Patterson's book. Mr. Patterson's book is if you've read it, I've read it, it is mostly based on this one survivor whom he did not interview. And I know this for a fact because I've interviewed that survivor. She's on air, on camera, in my Daily Beast, January 2015 piece. I've interviewed her and her mother. And I've known them for many, many years, as you can imagine, certainly since 2010. And so Mr. Patterson and his co-author, Mr. Connolly, wrote a book about a victim they didn't even interview. Granted, you know, that's not obviously necessary, but it's better if you write a book about someone to interview them. I was not allowed, sorry. I was
Well, I
not.
was just going to add that I did read that book also, and it struck me as a money grab. That book, it had.
Well, it was based on my stories. If you know, I hate to say this because it sounds so braggadocious, but because I'm coming from a wholly different place, you know, I'm trying to advocate for laws and for enforcement of current laws to protect our children in this country. That's really, truly what I want. That's my mission in life. I hope, and I knew from the get-go, Jim, that the moment this case became what it is today, the laws would change. And so I have somewhat succeeded. This was not for money. I mean, it's great if money comes in because I've invested a lot of time and hours and sweat and blood and tears. But for me, this was all about creating new laws and enforcing the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, which didn't seem to be enforced when I read the Epstein case. That's why I wrote the book, Trafficking. That is why I wrote that book, and that is why I've now written my second book, which will be published by Simon & Schuster pretty soon. And that book will explain many things that other reporters have not explained and other people have not touched upon.
So what then would be your explanation, if you believe Dershowitz, for why Virginia would lie about that?
Well, imagine, it's not even Virginia. It's the lawyers. Who always makes the most amount of money in any case? It's usually the lawyer.
As a retired lawyer, I'm going to take the fifth on that question.
It's okay. I will allow you. I will accept it. But the thing is that the attorneys who represent Virginia, not today, because the attorneys who represented her recently was a very well-known attorney, David Boies. And his firm is very well-known and established, as you know. However, the attorney who began with the Virginia case and who then gave it over to David Boies' firm, and in fact, I was involved in that because I introduced the attorney Stanley Pottinger to attorney Brad Edwards. And the reason I did that is because Mr. Pottinger was a friend and he was looking for clients. He needed clients because he was loosely associated with Mr. Boies back in 2010. When I met Mr. Pottinger, I think it was maybe 2012 or 13, but he was looking for cases. And I knew that Mr. Edwards was over his head, not that he couldn't fulfill, of course, his legal obligations, but that, you know, the cases were difficult, challenging. Mr. Epstein had a lot of money. Mr. Edwards at that time, not any longer, had a very small firm. He had had to deal with Epstein's shenanigans, which were plenty. And so I thought that it would be best for both attorneys, Edwards and Pottinger, to come together. And so I made an email introduction and a phone introduction, and that's how they became partners, which is wonderful. And in fact, when I suggested to Mr. Edwards, he had filed a RICO case against Epstein, and I had said to him, you know, Brad, this is not a RICO case. This is a child sex trafficking case. He re-identified the case, which is the best thing he ever did. So I'm humbled and grateful that he took on my suggestion to re-identify the Epstein case. And he didn't pursue the RICO path because he was getting nowhere with that. And so I really believe that, you know, these cases have developed in ways that you and I can only imagine. You as an attorney, me as an advocate, you know, at the end of the line, the attorneys who don't have a name, Mr. Edwards started off without a name. He was up against a very rich and influential man, Mr. Epstein. Mr. Epstein had a dream team of attorneys, beginning with Professor Dershowitz, ending with Kenneth Starr. So how does a man like Edwards, without a name, in a little firm in South Florida, hardly known to anyone, much less the world, how is he going to make a name for himself? Nobody was taking the Epstein cases seriously, as you know. I mean, nobody. You know how many times 27 publishers turned me down when my agent submitted Trafficking? 27 publishers.
Well, and that was a big part of the documentary too, wasn't it? About the Vanity Fair article where that author, remind me her name, was
Vicky
Ward?
Ward. Vicky Ward. She went back. You know, she has been going back and forth. Her first article, obviously, because of Mr. Carter, Graydon Carter, because he was very good friends with Ghislaine Maxwell. So Graydon Carter. It wasn't that Mr. Newhouse, Cy Newhouse, who owns Condé Nast, who owns Vanity Fair. Well, the late Cy Newhouse, he has since passed. But Cy Newhouse owned Condé Nast, which owned Vanity Fair, and Graydon Carter was very close to Ghislaine, and he was never going to allow any story that created, you know, a problem for Miss Maxwell and Mr. Epstein, because they had all the powerful people in their pocket. So, but Miss Ward should have, I think, when I wrote the Daily Beast piece in 2010, she should have absolutely come out immediately and said, hey, this is true. She didn't do that. In fact, she wrote a piece on behalf of Ghislaine Maxwell and Mr. Epstein, and she called Epstein's criminal acts, quote, and I quote this, peccadillos, which shocked me. And I went to my editor, Tina Brown, and I said to Tina Brown, Tina, how could Vicky Ward call Epstein's criminal acts peccadillos? She said, don't get into a fight with Vicky Ward. And I didn't, and I dropped it. And I thought, you know what, this is not about me or her. This is about what we need to do to change the law.
Yeah, and well, it is interesting in the documentary, Vicky is essentially saying that she was crying and totally beside herself that that part of her story, that Epstein was abusing underage girls, was taken out of the article. Sounds like you don't believe that.
I'd like you to read her subsequent blogs after the 2003. She wrote a couple of articles. Hopefully they haven't been taken down, but the links are in my book, in Trafficking. And I'd like you to read them, and I want you to form your own opinion.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, it's a big base for the whole documentary, because they're insinuating that had that come to light in 2003,
absolutely,
everything would have changed, because there was the two sisters in New York,
absolutely,
whose stories were never told.
Absolutely correct. If Miss Ward had pressed for that story to come out in 2003, Epstein would have been in jail.
Well, and to your point, it didn't even necessarily have to be in the story. Okay, so Vanity Fair doesn't publish it, but she knows the truth. She could have still spoken out on it.
Absolutely. She could have gone to another publication. I went to multiple publications. I mean, I can tell you how many newspapers I went to, beginning with the New York Times and ending with the Wall Street Journal and the Miami Herald. The Miami Herald didn't want to hear about the Epstein case. And it was geographically, you know, viable for them.
Yeah. So bottom line, wrapping up on Dershowitz, you believe Dershowitz over Virginia, and therefore Virginia's credibility really is significantly damaged, because if she's making this up about Dershowitz, we're not sure exactly what we can believe and what not to believe from her.
Well, I believe this. I believe that Virginia was a victim. I still see her as a victim, because this was a young girl. You know, at that age, you are frail. You're full of innocence and full of hope and dreams, and I think she was a young girl who had a very hard childhood. She was raped by a man named Ron Eppinger before Epstein, who just, according to her deposition, happened to be Epstein's friend. I've never met Ron Eppinger. I don't know who he is. I've never interviewed him. I've never even attempted to do so. However, it's very interesting to know, according to Virginia Roberts, that she was raped by this friend of Epstein, and then that she would agree, and that her father, who lived close by, would agree to allow Epstein to pay for his daughter's apartment for 2 years. That, to me, is just odd. You know?
Isn't that the father pimping out his daughter?
Well, that's what it seems like to me. So to me, this poor girl absolutely is a victim, but did, in fact, the question you asked, do I believe Mr. Dershowitz? I have to say I do. I have to say that I have spoken to him for a long time now. I just don't see how he could have. Did he have massages by girl? Maybe she gave him a massage. I mean, did he have massages? I would believe that, absolutely. What person doesn't have a massage? I mean, yes. But did it go from a massage by a 14-year-old to sexual intercourse or assault? That's a whole different kettle of fish.
All right, let's turn to Bill Clinton. So in the documentary, they talk about the number of flights that he was on with Epstein, and I know it was in the 20s. I think I wrote down 28, whatever it was. But is that, you agree with that number? It's in the 20s?
Yes, I have the pilot log and I have the manifestos. And according to the documents, he was on different flights, on different years, different dates, different times, 26 times.
Okay, so 26 times on the plane, and according to the documentary, again, I think it was the AV guy on the island who said that he saw Clinton on the island.
Alone.
Yes, but Clinton says, I've never been to the island. So who do you believe on that one?
Well, I think one must respect a president of any country, and with due respect. Mr. Clinton has been caught lying so many times. Before he became president of the United States, there were 9 lawsuits filed against him by women who claimed sexual harassment. I don't believe Mr. Clinton is a person who always tells the truth.
So most likely he was on the island, but he's lied about that. So then if he didn't engage in any improper conduct, you could ask, then why is he lying about being on the island? I think Dershowitz was on the island, and it sounds, based on the AV guy and some of his stories, that, sometimes there was lots of hijinks going on the island, and sometimes there wasn't. A guy could come on and nothing is going on, and Epstein is conducting a business meeting. So why Clinton would deny going to the island is definitely pretty suspicious if, in fact, he was there, number one. Number two, 24 times on a private jet with Epstein, basically, it seems to me, tells you that he had to know what Epstein was up to, regardless of whether or not he participated in it.
One time with Epstein, with girls on the plane, you would know. One time, not 24.
Well, and to be clear, so on these 24 trips, are you saying there was girls on the plane each time?
Well, from what I've read, if you read the current cases, I think one young lady claims that she was a model, and I don't want to give her name, but this Jane Doe claims that she was a model and that she went with Mr. Epstein, with the late Epstein, and with President Clinton to Africa. And she was taken on that trip because, and she names not only President Clinton, but Kevin Spacey and Chris Tucker, because Epstein wanted to introduce her to his friends.
Well, is that the same woman that's interviewed in the documentary?
Yes.
Okay. So, but she does not allege that anything untoward happened on that trip.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm not saying there is. I'm just saying that there were girls. So the president, the former president, is a very bright man and an intuitive man.
Well, I keep wondering, when the other shoe's going to drop as it pertains to other men, because it's certainly believed that this was some type of a blackmail scheme. And if it was a blackmail scheme, then he's got the goods on men with underage women. So do you believe
I'm sorry,
it was
who is he? I'm sorry.
Epstein, I should have spoken to him in the past, but Epstein, if it was a blackmail scheme, he had the goods on some very important men.
Oh, absolutely. That's why he had cameras in all of his homes and monitors. And I believe that's also why the FBI raided his private island home after he died. I mean, the case was closed. You know, they knew that the case was going to be closed. You cannot have a criminal case with a dead person against a dead person. So why would the FBI, after the fact, meaning after his death on August 12th, 2019, raid his private island home? They were looking for something.
So you have no doubt that he was running a blackmail scheme?
Epstein?
Yeah.
I don't think he was running it. I just thought he protected himself in every way. And the way to protect yourself, if girls are going to come forward and claim, obviously, criminal activity, he's going to make sure, or he was going to make sure, that everyone else who was involved in the same criminal activities was also going to get caught.
Right. So there's a big difference between that, basically just to protect his own perverted lifestyle,
right,
versus affirmatively getting goods on people, not just so he has protection for himself, if it were to come to that, but to affirmatively use against them to get policy changes that he or people putting him in this position, i.e. Israel, Mossad. So where do you stand on that?
Well, look, two things. Number one, in one of the depositions, Virginia Roberts claims in the deposition, and I quote, that Epstein told her when she asked why Bill Clinton was on the plane, and this was on a deposition taken by Jack Scarola and Brad Edwards over the telephone after Sharon Churcher published the Prince Andrew scandal with Virginia Roberts. And they took a deposition in 2011. And in 2011, Virginia tells Mr. Scarola and Mr. Edwards, Epstein told me that they are in my pockets, meaning Mr. Clinton and everyone else who was influential, who flew with him, was in his pockets, in his pocket. Why? We have to ask ourselves, why were they in his pocket? They did each other favors, he explained. Epstein explained to Virginia. So that's number one. Number two, I believe that Mr. Epstein knew what he was doing. He was, I knew Epstein. He was a highly intelligent man. He was a numbers man. He was driven by only one thing, and that thing that drove him was money. That's all he wanted. You know, he was not a married man. He was not a family man. He'd never had children with anyone. And he didn't even have animals. You know, it wasn't a man who liked animals or liked children or no. He was driven by only one thing, money and being around powerful people.
And sex.
Well, absolutely. And sex.
Which again kind of begs that question. He clearly was a sex addict, and he knows that he was engaging in conduct that was illegal. Not all of his conduct was illegal, because I think some of the women were of age, but many were not. So was the recording of others simply to protect him if he ever got into trouble, or do you believe that he was using it on behalf of some type of other foreign interest to blackmail them?
I think it could have been both. I know one thing. I've been digging a little bit more, as you can imagine, Jim. And we know now, given a New York Times report that came out back in 2004 by a reporter named Lisa Miller, who is no longer with the New York Times. I think she's now either with the New Yorker or not the New Yorker. I think she was now with the New York Magazine. And it wasn't the New York Times, forgive me, it was the Wall Street Journal. And she wrote about a group called the Mega Group. And it is a group, a very worthwhile group, in fact. Professor Dershowitz confirmed the presence of this group. Their mission is to raise charity for Jewish causes. And I believe, from what I have found so far, that Epstein was a sort of ornament for this group. So perhaps, back to your question, these were the men who belonged to the mega group, are considered America's 20 richest Jewish men. And I don't wish to name them, I'm sorry, but I believe that if they used Epstein, because I know that Professor Dershowitz spoke at the group's home, let's just say that the co-founder of that group was Leslie Wexner. He is a co-founder of the mega group. And if their mission was to raise charity for Jewish causes, their secondary mission was to influence US foreign policy toward the Middle East. Well, take that a step further. I'm sure you know what that means. So in light of this mission, there are a lot of things that anyone in power needs to do to influence US foreign policy. One of them can be as simple as bribing, threatening, taking pictures. You know, Ehud Barak was a good friend of Epstein. He came in and out of Epstein's home. He was on his plane. There are pictures of him walking into Epstein's Manhattan townhouse with young girls. Well, he was not only the prime minister, he was also the defense minister. Why was he friends with Epstein? What was Epstein giving him beside the money that he gave him to start Carbine, a company that Mr. Barak owns? And so, I'm sorry.
Don't you think perhaps the answer lies in the plea deal from South Florida, where we still scratch our heads as to how he got off? We know that he had the dream team of dream teams as far as lawyers are concerned, but even that doesn't quite explain the sweetheart deal that they got. And we know that the Attorney General was consulted on that and weighed in, and it certainly looks like something was waved off. What's your...
Well, I don't want to give it all away because I want you to read my second book.
Okay.
But a lot of that information confirmed is in my second book. What really happened? I'm just going to say this. Unlike what everyone believes, that Mr. Acosta was the culprit behind that non-prosecution agreement, I now have confirmation from two attorneys who worked on the case, on the Epstein non-prosecution agreement, that Acosta had his hands tied from the get-go. And it was never negotiated by Acosta. Of course, as the United States Attorney's Office, he was a representative. So yes, he takes the blame. He's the fall guy. But the deal was never negotiated by Acosta. It was negotiated on the USAO side by Jeffrey Sloman and Ana Maria Villafana. And on the Epstein side, it was negotiated by Kenneth Starr and Jay Lefkowitz, but then it went all the way to the top. And when I asked Professor Dershowitz why, he said it was too high profile. And that's why Acosta did not negotiate the case.
And what made it high profile?
Well, let's begin with Mr. Leslie Wexner and then work our way down.
Mm-hmm. And Bill Clinton.
Of course. And I only say Leslie Wexner before President Clinton because he's worth many billions more than President Clinton.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's talk about that relationship quickly. We did a full episode on that with the guy from Ohio who was featured in the documentary, and blanking on his name, the reporter there. But they sort of imply in the documentary that Epstein had sexual relations with Wexner as a way to basically blackmail him.
You know, I am not or was ever in Mr. Epstein's head, thank God. But I must say that was a very long-term relationship. It was an intimate relationship for many, many years. And there is no doubt that when a man gives another man the power of attorney over his entire financial estate, the feelings run deep.
And when supposedly Epstein betrayed him and supposedly stole $50 million. Wexner didn't do anything about it.
Well,
only recently has he reported that.
right. I find it odd, like you, that he did not report a crime worth $46.7 million that allegedly Mr. Wexner claims Epstein extorted 10 years earlier. If you go missing $46.7 million, even if it's your best friend, wouldn't you report it to the police? I mean, by the way, you've got to report it to the IRS, right?
So we know the FBI is moving on this because the latest news, I think it was this week, is that they are insisting on meeting with Prince Andrew. So I'd like to get your thoughts on that, but also on if they want to meet with Prince Andrew, seems to me they should want to meet with Bill Clinton and Les Wexner.
I totally agree. I completely agree with you.
But that's getting pretty serious if the FBI is insisting on meeting with a former president.
Well, it's not the FBI. It's the Attorney General, William Barr. The Attorney General, William Barr, gave an interview, I believe it was this past Monday, June 8th, to a special report, Fox News. And in the interview, Mr. Brett Baer asks him point blank, will Prince Andrew be extradited? And Mr. Barr, and I don't wish to quote him, but Mr. Barr said something to the effect, we want to interview him. Interview is the word that he used. And so I believe that when the Attorney General of the United States wishes to interview someone, that person will be interviewed.
Mm-hmm. So the allegation against him was made by Virginia herself. Again, she doesn't accuse him of doing something on the island. It was on this trip to London where they go out to a nightclub. The picture's taken that night, and then she has sex with him that night, according to her. How old would she have been at that point?
Well, if she was only with Mr. Epstein the 2 years that she claims she was living with Mr. Epstein, and
only with Andrew, you mean? If she was with Andrew during those 2 years, yeah.
No. If she was only with Mr. Epstein, meaning she could only have been no older than 17, because she starts with she starts living with Epstein, meets Epstein at 15, and she only stays with him 2 years until she goes to Thailand. So 1998 through 2000. So she must, if it's true that, if her claims are true, then she must have met Andrew between 1998 and the year 2000. But then go back to when Prince Andrew met Jeffrey Epstein. And according to Prince Andrew, he met Jeffrey Epstein in 1999 in Palm Beach through Ghislaine Maxwell. So if Andrew met Epstein in 1999 for the very first time, then obviously Miss Roberts could only have had 1 year in which to have serviced Andrew at Epstein's behest.
So it makes it very likely that she was perhaps 17, and what are the rules in Britain about that? Is 17
well, 17
age of consent?
of age. Oh, yes, it's age of, in London, 17 is age of consent, but it is not in New York, and not in the USVI, and not in Florida. And she claims that she was sexually abused by Andrew in New York, where the age of consent is 18, or at least it was at that time. I think it might have changed to 16. And in the USVI, it's 18.
But, regardless of the age of consent and wherever it took place, which makes it technically statutory rape.
Yes.
The truth is, I think most people are not going to get terribly worked up about 17. No. I know a lot of states are actually 16.
Yes.
Give me your thoughts on that. What should be the age of consent? Should we be upset about I don't know how old he was at the time, a mid 40-year-old man having sex with a 17-year-old?
Look, I don't, making love with someone or having sex with someone is such a personal, private, intimate matter. And I think every girl is different. perhaps to a 16-year-old girl, having to have intercourse with a man she loves or likes a lot is no big deal. Yet to another girl, it is catastrophic. So it wouldn't be correct of me to say that one age should be legal over another. You know, children develop at different stages, and a 14-year-old could be very promiscuous, and a 16-year-old could be saint-like. So, you know, however, states have different laws, and it really depends if the girl or the boy, and you know, believe that they were being abused and they were not voluntarily having intercourse with someone, then, you know, that is a criminal matter.
Well, and it raises the bigger question regarding Epstein, and that is, how upset should we be about all this? I mean, all of us know that if we're talking about true children,
right,
it's absolutely disgusting, and you want to see the person,
victims,
executed on the spot.
Absolutely.
It starts getting very murky when you start talking about 16 and 17-year-olds. Yes, there's some allegations that go down to 14. And I think we'd all probably very easily agree that 14 is definitely too young. But it also seems like those were more the exception rather than the rule. That, I mean, first of all, I think a lot of the women were 18 or older. And in fact, in the documentary, there's the masseuse that talks, and she was 20 years old. So this wasn't exclusively about underage.
Well, no, wait. I've read too many cases. I've read hundreds of filings. Many girls were 14, 15. Many girls. In fact, there's one girl in this documentary that claims that she was a victim. In fact, I really didn't see her as a victim, and I'll tell you why. Her name is Haley Robson, and she was 17, according to the police arrest report, according to the deposition, several depositions. Haley Robson met Epstein in Florida at his Palm Beach home, and that, according to her, she did not allow him to touch her when he attempted to touch her on their first visit, when he asked her to give him a massage. And he realized right away, according to his deposition and her deposition and the police report, that she was a no-nonsense kind of girl. And in fact, she is, because her father is a retired policeman. And Haley Robson, from the get-go, told Epstein, I will bring girls. And he agreed. He actually asked her, if he couldn't touch her, would she be amenable to bringing girls? And she started bringing girls. In fact, she brought the girl who opened the Epstein case. She's the one who brought that girl into Epstein's sphere. And I also believe that and she was 17 years old. Haley Robson was 17, soon to be 18. State age of consent in Florida is 18. And Epstein did not touch her. So was she a victim, as she claims in the Netflix documentary? I'm not so sure.
Well, and there is, I think, one woman, and I think it was the masseuse, again, who I think was 20, and my initial reaction is, okay, she's 20 years old, why is she even in this? But then she ultimately accused him of raping her. Right. What is your belief regarding flat out, traditional, not statutory rape, but regular rape? Well, because to your point, that was a story where the woman said no, and Epstein didn't go forward with it. He seemed to have plenty of women who were willing to do it in response to being paid. So do you believe any of these outright violent rape allegations?
The one thing I sensed always about Epstein is that he was not a violent man, meaning I think he was a bit of a coward, in the sense that if somebody tells him, and I've read many of his depositions, and when he has tried to do something and the girls have not wanted him to, he has stopped. That's what I've read. And so I think a 20-year-old, it all now boils down to money. Everybody wants, he has an enormous estate, 600 million estate. So anybody who can get a part of that money is going to come forward. And that's what we've got to realize, that many of these girls, I haven't read every case, meaning all the hundreds of cases, but I've read enough to know that I think the girls that continuously come to his house, remember, these girls were not shackled. They were not forced to live with him. He didn't have them in a basement. They came voluntarily to his house and were paid $200 upwards to perform sexual services. Were they victims at 14, 15? Yes, absolutely, because they knew very little about life and about things. And were they in a vulnerable position? Absolutely. But you have to ask yourself, I certainly ask myself, why would someone stay with someone if they feel bad? They're not shackled. They're not, locked up in a room, so they can freely come and go. If they're 16 years old, 17, if they feel bad, why are they coming back again and again?
And how do you explain that? Is that part of the victimhood?
Yes, I think it is. I think it's partially part of low self-esteem, broken home. Many of these girls had a very difficult home life. All of that is part of it. Lack of, financial security, perhaps living with one parent and not both. I mean, many elements come into play here.
So the thing that you would be most worked up about as far as Epstein goes would be the recruitment of these girls who would have been more, say, 14, 15, 16.
16, 17. I think it's still a 14, 15-year-old girl. I mean, I don't know, I've spoken to many victims, and because of my work, I am around young victims and see them and talk to them. And so a 14, 15-year-old girl is really a little girl.
Mm-hmm. Do you think we're going to hear other names of men?
I think so.
Do you know of any that we haven't heard of yet? Or do we need to wait for the book?
You'll know soon.
And what about Ghislaine? How, you watch the documentary and you're just thinking, holy cow, at least the way they portray it, she's right there with him through all this, even participating in sex acts with him. And you wonder, man, what is taking them so long to get a hold of her?
Well, there is, I want to quote what Professor Dershowitz said, because I asked him something today. There is not one criminal suit filed against Ghislaine Maxwell. And all of them are civil, as you know. And I thought to myself, why hasn't any of the survivors come forward and filed a criminal complaint? And we know that 2 years ago, the statute of limitation was changed for victims of sex trafficking. There is no longer a statute of limitations. So I asked Professor Dershowitz, and I'm going to quote what he said. He said, the Constitution does not permit expanding a statute of limitation for a crime after it has expired. You're an attorney.
Yeah, well, that came up big time with the Catholic Church and them trying to expand it for that. And I think Dershowitz is probably right. It doesn't make sense that you could expand it after the criminal act, but I believe in the Catholic Church situation, they did so and may prosecute it based on that. So I'm not sure what the courts are saying about that.
Right. Well, I think that's a legal matter that has to be taken up, and that's a law that should change, because if survivors are allowed to file civil complaints and receive damages, i.e. compensation, financial compensation, they should also be able to file criminally. And
so where do you think she is?
Ghislaine, in a non-extraditable country.
And probably not going anywhere soon.
No.
Last thing to just touch on, of course, is Epstein's death, and all the conspiracy theories there. Documentary touches on it. notes that, Michael Baden, who now is coming up again in the George Floyd case, he seems to be the guy, also in the OJ case, who comes forward and gives the autopsy report that whoever hired him to give wants, right? So Epstein's brother hires him, doesn't want it to be suicide, presumably perhaps because of insurance or who knows why. And sure enough, Baden comes back and says, probably not suicide, even though the medical examiner had said suicide. In the George Floyd situation, you also had the family hiring him, and he comes up with an autopsy report that is different than the Minnesota health examiner had come up with. So that seemed to me to be the only evidence the documentary presented that it was other than suicide. What are your thoughts?
Two things. I spoke to Mark. I have been speaking to Mark Epstein since Epstein was arrested. His brother was arrested. Very early on, I think the very first conversation that I had with Mark Epstein, which was lengthy, I said to him, he said to me in passing, I hadn't seen Jeff in 7 years. And I said, why, Mark? Why didn't you see your brother in 7 years? And he said, because I told him that I would see him at the morgue. That was his response when we first spoke in July of 2019.
What did he mean by that?
And I said, what do you mean by that? He said, well, I knew that somebody was going to kill him, and I told him so. So he said this to me before his brother died. Second thing, wait, I have to go on.
And he had, sorry, to be clear, he had said that 7 years prior.
Yes, he had told Epstein.
So in 2012-13, he was telling his brother, someone's going to kill you.
According to Mark Epstein, in my conversation with Mark Epstein, the first week after his brother is arrested, Jeffrey Epstein is arrested July 6, 2019. I spoke to Mark that week, and he said this to me. Epstein was not dead or had not attempted his first suicide yet. I was also in conversation with an active federal agent, FBI agent. And that first week when Epstein was arrested, the agent said to me, quote, Epstein will not make it to trial, period. There are towels on the inside, period. And I asked the agent, what do you mean? I was confused. I said, what do you mean towels on the inside? What does that mean? And he said, figure it out, Conchita. On August 10th, Saturday. Well, there was the first suicide attempt, July 23rd, and then the second one.
Okay, so just to break those two comments down real quickly, towels on the inside, that to me means suicide. Is that what you think the FBI agent was saying, or is he saying homicide?
No, homicide. No.
But you can commit suicide with towels too, though.
But there aren't towels. See, the thing is that the inmates are not allowed towels. They're allowed towels when they take a shower 3 times a week, but the towels have to stay in the. Remember what his cell? He was in the shoe unit. I don't know if you've seen what it looks like.
And back to what the brother said, where he tells Epstein, you're going to be killed. By whom?
Well, Mark Epstein certainly didn't know, I think, or he certainly didn't tell me. But I mean, think about it.
But Mark says that I told my brother 7 years ago, you're going to be killed. Okay.
Yeah. No. That's not what he said. He said, I told Jeff that I would see him at the morgue. And I said, what do you mean, Mark? And he said, well, because I knew he would be killed.
By whom, though, do you think?
Well, he didn't say. But I mean,
clearly he thought something was swirling around that was going to come back to him.
Absolutely. And he also said to me that Jeffrey did not allow him to socialize with his friends. So Mark and Jeffrey did not socialize together. Mark is a married man with children, and quite different than his brother in many aspects. I think he loves his brother very much. I have when I talk to him, I get the feeling that he definitely, loved and admired his brother. But I don't think they were friends.
Okay, so we have Bodden saying he thinks it may have been homicide, but other than that, other than speculation, I'm not aware of any evidence that it was homicide. I mean, somebody had to have gotten into that cell without leaving any sign of entry, exit, etc.
I'm going to tell you one thing that I'm sure you already know, but I'm going to hopefully remind you. 3 doors from Epstein was Mexico's most notorious cartel leader, El Chapo Guzman. He was 3 doors away from Epstein in the SHU unit. It is much too strange that the 2 female lawyers who signed Epstein's will and testament on August 8th, 2019, happened to have been El Chapo Guzman's attorneys. I spoke to one of them. She didn't want to comment. Miss Colon Miro. I spoke to her. I called her because to me it was just shocking. Epstein had no idea who these 2 female lawyers were before he went into MCC. He had 3 lawyers. He had Mr. Weinberg, Mr. Weingarten, and the 3rd partner. David Schoen claims that he was, in this documentary, David Schoen also claims that he was going to represent Epstein, that Epstein had agreed. That is not the case. I have emails from both Mr. Weinberg and Mr. Schoen telling me the truth of that statement.
So the attorneys that did Epstein's will had also been representing El Chapo, is what you're saying?
El Chapo Guzman. There were
now,
2.
By the way, as you know, that's a very specialized area of law to do a will and testament. So presumably they were doing El Chapo's will and testament.
Yes, but think about it. Epstein could have had anyone. Don't you think he could have said to Martin Weinberg, Marty, get me the best will and estate attorney? You don't think Mr. Weinberg was capable of bringing in the top will and estate attorney?
Yeah. Okay, but then
why did Epstein hire 2 attorneys he didn't know, female attorneys representing El Chapo?
Okay, but I'm confused. So your theory is what then? As to why he would have hired El Chapo's attorneys?
Well, I think it goes deeper than that. I think if Epstein wanted to disappear from the planet, there's only one man who could have helped him disappear, and he was 3 cell doors away. That's what I think. And so when you ask me about how could it have happened on the inside, you don't think a man like El Chapo had all the contacts in the world on the inside, on the outside, and everywhere around?
To assist someone in murdering Epstein.
Or helping him kill himself. Or however, I mean, just, I don't usually believe in conspiracy theories. I try not to anyway. But just look at all the...
It's suspicious no matter which way it comes out. Suicide is suspicious and bizarre and very, very hard to believe that it could possibly happen in those circumstances, considering he had been on suicide watch and had attempted it before.
Yeah, suicide watch, and the fact that I was told by a federal agent only days after he went into jail.
Yeah,
I was told on the phone. I was told point blank, he will not make it to trial. Period. How was he so sure? How was this agent so sure?